I have been to 100 ballrooms in my life, and I have forgotten every one of them but this. The night I watched a room of 500 people decide, in the space of a single breath, that a good woman was a thief. I was standing near the orchestra when it happened, a glass of ratafia sweating in my hand, half listening to a colonel tell me about his gout. Harrington House was at the very height of its glory that evening, every chandelier ablaze, the marble floor a mirror of gold light, the air thick with hothouse lilies and the powder of 300 perfect coiffures. It was the finest ball of the season, thrown to celebrate the engagement of Miss Verity Ashby to Mr. Crispin Vale, and I remember thinking idly that I had rarely seen a girl look so quietly, so unshowily happy. She was not a beauty in the way the season prized. She had none of the dazzle of the Harrington daughters, no diamonds at her throat, no great name behind her. She was a poor relation, a lady's companion who had spent 4 years fetching shawls and reading aloud to a cross old dowager, and everyone in that room knew it. But there was something in her face, a stillness, a truthfulness that made you trust her before she had said a word. She stood at the edge of the dancing in a plain white gown, her dark hair simply dressed, watching Crispin Vale laugh with his friends, and there was such gentle wonder in her eyes that a man could not look at her and stay unmoved. I am ashamed of a great deal that I did that night, but I am not ashamed of having thought her lovely. The necklace changed everything. I did not see how it began, no one ever does at these things. There was a small commotion near the card room, a rising note of voices, and then a woman's cry, sharp and theatrical, cutting clean across the music. The orchestra faltered. The dancing stopped in pieces, couples turning like weather vanes toward the sound. And through the parting crowd came Lady Harrington herself, our hostess, her hand pressed to her breast, her face a mask of outrage, and behind her, holding something that flashed and dripped with light, came Miss Cecilia Marsh. Cecilia Marsh was Verity's cousin. I knew that much. What I did not yet know was what a viper she was. "Was in her room," Cecilia said, and though her voice trembled prettily, it carried to every corner of that vast hall. She held the thing aloft, a river of diamonds, the great Harrington necklace, worth more than most men earned in a lifetime. I did not want to believe it. I begged her to give it back quietly, but she would not, and I could not let a theft go unanswered under this roof. She turned her wide, wet eyes upon Verity. "I am so sorry, cousin. I did what I had to. I have turned that moment over 10,000 times since. The genius of it, the cruelty of it, to wrap a lie in the costume of a broken heart." Verity went very white. I saw it happen, the color leaving her face like water draining from a glass. "I never touched it," she said. Her voice was low but steady, steadier than I could have managed. "Cecilia, you know I never touched it. It was under your pillow." Lady Harrington's voice was iron now. She had loved that necklace. Her late husband had given it to her. "In your room, Miss Ashby. In the room I opened to you out of Christian charity." And then, I will never forget this, the whole room turned. I mean that they turned physically, the way a field of grass turns in a wind. 500 faces, an instant before curious and merely entertained, hardened altogether into judgment. I heard the whisper move through them like a tide. Thief, of course. A companion, a nobody, no family. What did anyone expect? Poor Lady Harrington, poor Mr. Vale, to be so nearly taken in. The lilies still perfumed the air. The candles still blazed. And in the center of all that gold light, Verity Ashby stood entirely, perfectly alone. She looked for Crispin Vale. I watched her look for him, and I watched him fail her. He was her betrothed, the man who, 3 hours earlier, had toasted her before this same company, calling her the truest heart in England. Now he stood among his friends and would not meet her eyes. When she said his name, just his name, Crispin, soft as a question, he flinched as though she had struck him, and he stepped back. He stepped back into the safety of the crowd and let it close over the space where he had been. "I think," he said to the floor, "there has been a terrible misunderstanding. I think Miss Ashby should be allowed to leave. Meaning, I wash my hands of her. Meaning, save me and I will let her hang." Someone laughed, a high, bright, ugly little sound, and Cecilia Marsh, still holding the diamonds, let one tear spill down her flawless cheek, and I truly did see, the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth. Triumph dressed as grief. "Let the little thief stand alone," a woman near me murmured to her companion, snapping open her fan. "It's what she is. It's all she ever was." And that, God help us, was the mood of the room. Not a soul moved toward Verity. Not one hand reached out. 500 of the finest people in the kingdom, and every one of us decided at once that the safest, the easiest, the most comfortable thing was to look away. I confess it now plainly, because I have carried it too long to pretend otherwise. I looked away too. I looked down into my glass of ratafia and I thought, this is not my affair, and I felt the coward's relief of a man who has decided that someone else's ruin is none of his business. I was 34 years old, and I had never in my life understood so clearly what I was made of, and I did not like it. It was in that moment, that low, shameful, silent moment, that I felt the man beside me move. I had not marked him before. He had been standing a little apart, as he always did, in the deep shadow beyond the last chandelier, a tall, dark figure who had spoken to no one all evening, and whom no one had dared to approach. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone gave him a wide berth. Alaric Thorne, the Duke of Ravenscar, the coldest, most feared man in England. They said a great many things about the Duke of Ravenscar. They said he had never smiled. They said he had ruined 3 men who crossed him and never raised his voice to do it. They said his heart had died with his young wife a decade past, and that what walked about London in his shape was only a beautiful, exquisitely tailored absence of a man. Mothers steered their daughters clear of him. Gentlemen lowered their voices when he passed. He was invited everywhere and welcomed nowhere, the way one invites a thunderstorm. He was my oldest friend. I had known him since we were boys, before the world froze him over, and I knew what almost no one else in that ballroom knew, that the coldness was a wall, and that behind it there was still a man, and that the man was better than any of us. But even I had not seen, until that night, how much watching he did, how still he stood at the edges of things, and how much those still dark eyes took in. He set down his glass. I heard the small click of it against the marble ledge, and he stepped forward out of the shadow into the light. I want to describe to you what it was like when the Duke of Ravenscar crossed that ballroom, because I do not think I shall ever see anything like it again. He did not hurry. He did not raise his voice. I do not believe he had spoken above a murmur all evening. He simply walked, and the crowd that had closed so tightly against Verity Ashby came apart before him like a curtain, everyone falling back, everyone suddenly, urgently interested in being somewhere his shoulder was not. The whispers died. The fans went still. 500 people who had been so brave a moment before, so united in their contempt for one friendless girl, discovered all at once that they had nothing whatever to say. He walked the length of that gleaming floor, past the sneering matrons and the shrinking gentlemen, past Crispin Vale, who went the color of ash, and he did not stop until he stood before Miss Verity Ashby, and then in front of the entire assembled cream of London society, before Lady Harrington and her diamonds, before the cousin with her false tears, before the man who had abandoned her, the Duke of Ravenscar bowed. A full, deliberate, unhurried bow, the kind a man gives to a queen. "Miss Ashby," he said, his voice was quiet and carried like a struck bell, "forgive me, I have kept my distance too long." I do not think Verity understood him. How could she? She only stared, her dark eyes enormous in her white face, trembling now, not weeping. She never once wept that whole terrible night, but trembling, the way a candle trembles when a door has opened somewhere far off. "Your Grace," she managed, I have not." "I know what you have not done," he said, and then still in that low, level, carrying voice, he turned not to her but to the room, to all of us. "You have condemned this woman," he said, "on the word of a weeping cousin and the discovery of a jewel. You have not asked one question. You have not troubled yourselves with one single fact. You have found it easier to believe the worst of the poorest person present, because it costs you nothing and it flatters you, and because a companion with no name and no fortune cannot fight back. He let his gaze move across them, slow and dark, and men who had ruined reputations for sport could not hold it. I have watched this room all evening. I would sooner trust Miss Ashby's silence than the whole of your applause, and I mean to prove that the trust is earned. I have never heard a silence like the one that followed. Now I must tell you what I had not understood, what none of us had understood about the Duke of Ravenscar and the poor companion in the plain white gown, because he had not chosen her that night by chance. He told me the whole of it, much later, sitting by his fire with the rain against the windows, and I set it down here as near to his own words as I can. He had first seen her the previous autumn, in a bookshop off Bond Street, on a gray, wet morning when the whole world seemed made of ash and drizzle. He had been standing among the shelves. He was always alone. It was the only place he was ever at peace, and he had watched a young woman in a much-mended pelisse come in out of the rain to fetch a book for her mistress. The bookseller had been rude to her, as men are rude to those they think cannot afford to be offended, and Ravenscar had waited for her to shrink or flush or flatter him back into civility. Instead, she had simply looked at the man steadily, without heat, and said, "You needn't speak to me so. I have done you no wrong, and I can pay." And she had, from a purse with very little in it, and she had thanked him with perfect courtesy that he had done nothing to deserve, and she had gone out again into the rain. I had forgotten, Ravenscar told me, that a person could be poor and unhumbled at once. I had forgotten that dignity was a thing you carried and not a thing you bought. I stood in that shop like a fool, and I thought, there is the only real person I have seen in a decade. After that he had noticed her everywhere, the way you do once your eye has learned a face. At the edges of drawing rooms, carrying an old woman's shawl. In the park, walking 3 paces behind her mistress, reading a borrowed novel as she went. At the opera, in the cheapest seats, weeping without shame at the music while the fashionable box beneath her gossiped through the whole of the second act. He learned her name. He learned her history, the dead clergyman father, the mother gone before that, the cousins who had taken her in and treated her as unpaid labor, the 4 grinding years of fetch this, read that, sit there, be silent. He learned that she had been engaged, quite suddenly that spring, to Crispin Vale, a match everyone thought absurdly above her, and that Verity herself, he suspected, had accepted more from loneliness than from love. And he, the coldest man in England, who had buried his heart with his wife and sworn never to dig it up again, had done nothing, said nothing, approached her not once. What would I have said? He asked me, and for the only time in our long friendship I heard him sound uncertain, almost young. I am 20 years too frozen for a woman like that. She deserves warmth, Edmund. What warmth had I to offer? I told myself it was kindness to leave her be. I told myself a great many pretty lies, and I stood at the edges of rooms and watched her, like a miser watching a fire he is too proud to sit beside. He looked into his own hearth. And then I watched a whole ballroom set that fire out, and I found I could not stand at the edge any longer. But that came after. On the night itself, in the ringing silence after his words, there was still the matter of the diamonds, and a lie, however cruel, is not undone by a duke's good opinion. It must be undone by the truth. Ravenscar turned to Cecilia Marsh. "You found the necklace," he said, "in Miss Ashby's room." "I did." She had recovered herself. She lifted her chin, all wounded virtue, beneath her pillow. "I am sorry for it with all my heart, but I cannot unsee what I saw." "Beneath her pillow," he repeated, as if considering it. "Tell me, when did you last enter Miss Ashby's room?" "A flicker, very small, but I was near enough to see it. This evening, when I found." "Before this evening?" I hardly know. We are cousins, I come and go." "You come and go," he nodded slowly. "And the necklace, when did Lady Harrington last see it in its case?" Lady Harrington, drawn in despite herself, answered, "At 6 o'clock. My maid dressed my hair and I chose not to wear it. It was in the blue case on my table." In your room. Not Miss Ashby's. Yes. So the necklace traveled, said the Duke of Ravenscar, sometime after 6 o'clock from Lady Harrington's dressing table to beneath Miss Ashby's pillow, a journey of some distance, through a house full of servants on the busiest evening of the year. He turned his dark gaze back to Cecilia, and his voice never rose, not by a hair, and it was the most frightening thing I have ever heard. Who carried it there, Miss Marsh? How should I know? She did. Miss Ashby has been in this ballroom in full view of 500 people since 8:30. He said it flatly, and I saw the room begin to remember that it was true. She had been there all evening, a dozen of us could swear to it. She has not left it once. She could not have carried anything anywhere. But you, and here at last something entered his voice, something with an edge. You were seen upon the stairs at 7:30. I saw you myself. I mark the exits of every room I stand in. It is an old and unlovely habit, and tonight it will do some good. You came down those stairs at 7:30, alone, and you were flushed and quick, and you did not see me in the shadow of the landing. Where had you been, Miss Marsh, at 7:30, on the floor where the bedchambers are? The tear was quite gone from her cheek now. And there is a simpler matter still, he went on, relentless and gentle at once. The case, Lady Harrington, the case the necklace was kept in. Where is it now? Lady Harrington blinked. Why, in my room, I suppose. Cecilia only brought the necklace itself. Only the necklace, Ravenscar agreed. Loose, in her hand, not the case. He looked at Cecilia. A thief in a hurry snatches the jewels and leaves the case, for the case is heavy and slow. But Miss Ashby, we are told, hid the necklace beneath her pillow, at her leisure, in her own room, with all night to do it. Why would such a careful thief leave the empty case sitting in Lady Harrington's chamber to be found and carry off only the stones? Unless the person who moved those diamonds was never in Miss Ashby's room at all, but only in Lady Harrington's, and took the necklace, and left the case, and carried the stones straight to a hiding place she had chosen in advance. A hiding place she could point to. A hiding place beneath the pillow of the cousin she wished to destroy. I remember that you could hear the candles. That is how quiet it was. The small hiss and sputter of 500 flames and nothing else. Send for the case, said the Duke of Ravenscar, and send Miss Marsh's maid to us and Miss Ashby's, and let us ask them gently what their mistresses did between 7 and 8 o'clock. The truth is a very small, very stubborn thing. It does not care how many people have agreed to look away from it. He paused. I am willing to spend the whole night finding it, Miss Marsh. Are you? She broke. I have seen men broken at the gaming table and at the dueling ground, and once terribly at a graveside. I had never seen anyone broken by the plain, patient, unanswerable arithmetic of the truth. Cecilia Marsh's lovely face crumpled all at once into something small and frightened, and she cried out, a real cry this time, nothing pretty in it. She was to have nothing. Do you understand? Nothing. No name, no fortune, no beauty, and he was to marry her. And I have £30,000, and I am handsome, and I have been out 4 seasons, and no one. And the confession came pouring out of her. Ugly and complete, jealousy and spite, and a plan hatched in a fortnight. And the whole ballroom that had so lately condemned Verity Ashby now recoiled from her cousin with exactly the same eager, righteous horror. There is no crowd on earth so cruel as one that has just discovered it was wrong, and would like very much to feel it was never its own fault. I did not watch Cecilia be led away. I was watching Verity. She had stood through all of it, the accusation, the abandonment, the Duke's defense, the slow, terrible unraveling of the lie without once giving way. And now, with her name restored to her in front of every person who had helped to take it, she did not weep, and she did not gloat, and she did not swoon into anyone's arms. She turned to the Duke of Ravenscar, and she said, in a voice not quite steady, "Why?" Just that, why? Why would you, the most feared man in England, cross a ballroom for a companion in a mended gown? Why would you spend your good name defending a nobody? Why me? And the Duke of Ravenscar, before all of London, gave her the truth, which was, I have come to think, The bravest thing he did all night, braver even than the crossing of the floor. "Because I have watched you for 8 months," he said, "and I have been too great a coward to do anything but watch. I saw you in a bookshop in the rain, and in the cheap seats at the opera, and 3 paces behind a cruel old woman in the park, and I have never in all that time seen you be anything but true. When the whole of this room chose the easy lie, you stood alone and would not tell it, even to save yourself. I have money and rank and a name that frightens children, Miss Ashby, and I would trade every particle of it for 1 ounce of the courage you showed standing on this floor tonight with no one beside you." His voice, so level all evening, roughened at last. "I told myself I left you in peace out of kindness. It was not kindness. It was fear. I am done being afraid. If you will let me, I should like to spend whatever years I have proving that you never again have to stand anywhere alone." I do not know what a woman is supposed to say to that. I do not think there is an answer written down anywhere. Verity Ashby looked up at him, this tall, dark, frozen man who had thought all at once in the middle of a ballroom for her sake, and something passed over her face that was too large for the room to hold. Not triumph. Not even yet quite love. That would come, and it did come, richly and for many years. What was in her face was something rarer, that I have only ever seen on the faces of people who have been very much alone and are, for the first time, not. "I have been told all my life," she said unsteadily, "to know my place, to be silent, to be grateful for whatever crumbs of kindness fell to me, and to expect no more." She drew a breath. "You are the first person in 4 years, Your Grace, to speak to me as though I were worth the trouble of the truth." "You are worth every trouble I have," he said, "and I have a great many." And she laughed, a small, broken, astonished laugh with tears finally standing in her eyes but not falling, and she put her hand in his. The room, of course, went mad. There was no scandal in the world so delicious as this. The Duke of Ravenscar, the ice of a decade, publicly, unmistakably, before all society, laying his heart at the feet of a disgraced and vindicated companion. The matrons who had murmured thief an hour before now murmured how romantic with exactly the same relish. Lady Harrington, mortified past speech, was already loudly declaring that she had never believed a word of it, that dear Miss Ashby had always been a treasure, that the whole dreadful business was that scheming Marsh girl's doing and everyone must have seen it. Crispin Vale had vanished entirely. I never saw him again in any drawing-room in London. A man who steps back when his betrothed needs him does not easily find another room that will have him. But I am not writing this to tell you that the cruel were humbled, though they were, richly and lastingly. I am writing it because of what I did next, and because of what it cost me to learn it. When the crowd surged forward, all warmth and false memory, I did not go with them. I stood where I had stood all along, at the edge, holding my warm glass of ratafia, and I looked at the 2 of them, the Duke I had known since boyhood and the woman I had watched be abandoned, and I was sick with myself, because I had looked away. In the moment that mattered, when it would have cost me nothing but a little comfort to cross that floor myself, to say one word, to stand beside her, I had looked into my glass and decided it was not my affair. My oldest friend, the coldest man in the kingdom, had found in himself a courage I did not possess, and I had congratulated myself on my discretion. Ravenscar found me afterward, when the ballroom had thinned and Verity had been carried off by a sudden riot of newly devoted friends. He put his hand on my shoulder, the way he had done when we were 15, and he said, "You went pale, Edmund. Are you unwell?" I looked away, I told him. I could not help it. It came out of me like a confession. Alaric, she stood there, and I looked into my glass. I would have let her go home ruined and told myself it was manners. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said the thing I have tried to live by ever since. "So did 500 people," he said. "The difference between you and them, Edmund, is that you are ashamed. Shame is not nothing. Shame is the beginning. A man who is ashamed of looking away has already started to turn back." He looked toward the door through which Verity had gone, and something in his hard face was almost soft. "I looked away for 8 months. I am not the man to lecture you on how long the turning takes. They were married in the autumn in a small church, with a very few people present and none of them fashionable. I was there. I had asked to be, and I had meant it, and when the clergyman spoke the words I found I could not see for the water in my eyes, I, who had not wept at anything since I was a boy. Verity Ashby, who had owned one mended gown and a purse with very little in it, became the Duchess of Ravenscar, and she wore the rank the way she had worn her poverty, without flinching, without apology, exactly herself. She was not, I will tell you, a great society hostess. She never learned to cut a person or to enjoy the cutting. But her house became, in the years that followed, the one house in London where a nervous debutante was never sneered at, where a poor relation was seated near the fire and not near the door, where a companion or a governess found herself, to her astonishment, addressed as though her opinion mattered. The Duke of Ravenscar unfroze so gradually and so completely that men who had feared him began to seek him out, and were startled to find, behind the fearsome name, a quiet man who watched everything and forgot nothing and was, when it counted, the last man in any room who would look away. I dined with them often. I watched them grow old together, which is the truest happiness I know how to describe. And every so often, across some crowded evening, I would catch the Duke's eye, and he would tilt his head a very little toward his wife, laughing with a shy young girl no one else had spoken to, or listening with her whole grave attention to some dull old soldier's story, and I would understand that he was saying, without a word there is the only real person I ever saw. And I very nearly let her stand alone. I have been to 100 ballrooms. I remember only one. And when I am tempted, as we all are, every day of our lives, to look into my glass and decide that someone else's ruin is not my affair, I think of a plain white gown in a sea of gold light, and a whole bright cruel room agreeing to look away, and one tall dark figure setting down his glass and stepping forward, and I set my own glass down. It is a small thing to cross a floor. It is the smallest thing in the world. I have come to believe it is very nearly the only thing that matters.